Greetings from the campus of the University of Notre Dame, home of Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. We are, to borrow a term from track and field, on the home stretch of season 1 of Curated Conversations, a Latinx poetry show. This is our 11th installment and features M. Soledad Caballero in conversation with Rebecca Morgan Frank, discussing Soledad's gorgeous book of poems, I Was a Belle, winner of the Benjamin Saltman Award and published by Red Hen Press in 2021. Before I introduce Rebecca, I want to thank and acknowledge a few individuals and organizations. Normally at this juncture, I thank Zach Powers. I mentioned that Zach is the Director of Communications at the Writers Center, our host. I also say that Zach is our tech guru and our web designer, and all of that is true. But today, I also want to share with you that Zach is the author of the novel First Cosmic Velocity, published in 2019 with Putman. Zach is also the author of the short story collection Gravity Changes, published by Boa Editions in 2017. All this to say, in addition to being a crucial member of the Curated Conversations team, Zach is an artist. I also want to thank the executive director of the Writers Center, Margaret Melanie, who gave her endorsement and support to this initiative from day one. A shout out as well to the Writers Center's in-house publication, Poet Lore, another co-presenter. A program like this wouldn't be possible without funding. The Poetry Foundation is our principal institutional benefactor. I also want to offer heartfelt gratitude to Jim Wilson, whose generosity has made possible a parallel book club component for the debut books we've been exploring throughout the series. In fact, Jim is one of Letras Latinas' most steadfast and loyal benefactors. And let me also say that Duende District Bookstore, run by Angela Spring, is a crucial partner for our book club component, as well as a co-presenter of the series. One of the special traits of Curated Conversations is that we ask our featured poets to select their interlocutors. Soledad has chosen Rebecca Morgan Frank. Rebecca is the author of 4 poetry collections, Oh, You Robot Saints, Sometimes We're All Living in a Foreign Country, and The Spokes of Venus, all from Carnegie Mellon University Press, as well as the author of Little Murders Everywhere, published by Salmon Poetry and finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. Her poems, essays, stories, and reviews have appeared widely, including in The New Yorker, American Poetry Review, Plowshares, The Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. She is the recipient of fellowships from such places as the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, the Sewanee Writers Conference, the Ragdale Foundation, and the Writers' Room of Boston. She holds an MFA from Emerson College and a doctorate from the University of Cincinnati. She is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the online magazine Memorious. Frank also serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle. As you can see, she is what I would call a model literary citizen. Frank currently lives just outside of Chicago, where she teaches in the MFA program in prose and poetry at Northwestern University. Let me wind this down by sharing a snippet of her work, the opening 3 lines of one of her poems. When I open my mouth to cry, I give you all my colors. And from Abel's first blood puddle, you paint fire in the trees. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Morgan Frank.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for having us here and for that lovely introduction. I could not be more thrilled to be here to speak with Soledad Caballero about her debut collection, I Was a Belle. Soledad is professor of English and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Allegheny College, and her scholarly work focuses on such areas as British Romanticism, travel writing, post-colonial literature. And she is also a poet. I met her as her teacher in her early days of studying poetry at Grub Street in Boston, where she was part of a group of poets who took my 10 poem 10 weeks class 3 times in a row. And over the years, she kept up with me, and I followed her successes, winning honors and awards such as the 2019 Joy Harjo Poetry Prize from Cutthroat, named finalist for contests at the Missouri Review, the Mississippi Review, and the Poetry Society of America, as Lucille Medwick Memorial Award. And over this time, as she was moving to this book, I had the opportunity to work with her on this manuscript. And I knew that this was going to be a special book, and love that she took the time to make it the gorgeous debut collection that it is. And, I think sometimes debut can almost feel like a qualifier, and I would take this away from this. This is just a beautiful book, lyrical, precise, expansive. Isabel delves into personal, national, and family history, into intersections of the body and self, of language and its intersections with silence. It traces a path from the immigration office to the front of the college classroom, diverging into flight, into history, into what's buried. It questions access to language and explores the role of the body, both to the self and as it intersects with power structures, from dictatorships to hospitals, as a cancer diagnosis changes the course of the book and carries us, the readers, with her in new directions. The beauty of this collection moves beyond the story behind it. It's in the precision of the line, its musicality, and the way that shapes the tone and pacing of these poems. One feels in the hands of such a deft poet through these. And as the speaker says in her poem, The Spell, exiled fathers, sisters, lovers, I have not found them but as a song, a wailing tune, a funeral march, charred bone and dust, pulp eulogy, this spell of history, a dingy, broken memory. I Was a Bell is a standout book of 2021 and one of the best debut books I've read. I know I'm a little biased as a teacher and as someone who's worked on that, but I really, I stand by that. And Soledad, thanks for inviting me here to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Morgan. I'm just thrilled to be here with you. This feels like the culmination of a lot of work for us, but I also want to thank Francisco for inviting me to be part of this, and all of the various contributors that have made this brilliant curated collection possible.
It's wonderful to be here. Well, let's just dive in. We have so many questions for you, Soledad. So I'm going to start with, at the heart of this collection are two central autobiographical journeys, as I alluded to just a moment ago, that of you and your family immigrating from Chile in the 80s under Pinochet to the US, and specifically to Oklahoma, and that of your treatment for cancer while writing this book. In your poem, To Document, you begin to mark, to list, to catalog, to register, to chronicle, to cite, to make, to seal, to stamp, and later come back to the line, paper means nothing. Can you talk about this book as a way of reclaiming the act of documentation from its role as a bureaucratic means of control and excision, both in the immigration process and in healthcare settings? I feel like you've transformed these into affirmation and engaged chronicle, reclaiming them.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a good question. So one thing about the collection is, it did merge these two sort of autobiographical streams. I was in a place where I was able to think back, I think, in a more systematic way about how the memory of immigrating, made it possible for me to look back. And so I think I was thinking about both personal autobiographical memory, and then the things that we know are memories, but we don't quite know until we start thinking about them. I work with a scientist in my academic world, and She's a cognitive psychologist, and she works with memory. She talks about the processes of memory. And one of the things I've learned working with her, which was so true as I was putting together this piece, this book, is that every time we remember something again, it's a new memory. It gets re-registered in our kind of autobiographical semantic and autobiographical memory. And I think that was the process for me of putting this collection together. Was I wanted it to be very personal, but I was also interested in thinking of memory collectively, and the fact that, you know, there are a lot of ways to think about collective memory. Chile is a particular place because of its own political history of the dictatorship and the echoes of that dictatorship afterward, that scholars that study Chile think about the way memory has been erased post Pinochet, and so there are, you know, films like Obstinate Memory, where there's a desire to not remember, to sort of not think about documenting the violence that happened in the Pinochet era. Strangely, cancer works in interestingly similar ways that I would not welcome for anyone. Like, I wouldn't want them to have to think about a project of memory along these lines, but I think a lot right now about what it is that my body still remembers that I have no access to in a cognitive way because of the treatments that I went through with cancer. And one way to answer your question is I wanted to document, because I think one way of thinking about documentation is also to name. Naming is so important, and I'm really inspired by Audre Lorde, who tells us, right, that the first act of liberation is the ability to name the things that we have not been allowed to name, that have been not give, and to make our own naming, as opposed to be named by, right? And so I think when I was thinking about being to document, right? And of course, with an immigrant, documentation also has the idea of who has legal documentation, who is quite legally here or not legally here. And I think I was trying to use poems as a way to create an alternative way of documenting that isn't rooted in institutions, but is rooted in the ability to name the thing we want to name.
That's beautiful. I love that, connecting back to Lorde, and that, you know, the naming and this specificity in this book is one of its powers. But so one of the, I guess, the follow-up questions that I would ask is, you were of course a child when you immigrated. So as we're talking about memory, there are some things that you remember, but one of the challenges, and what were the challenges and opportunities when talking about this family or national history, and how did you mine those gaps in your own memory? Was there research involved? I know you took a sabbatical trip to Chile, or did you have, you know, conversations and interviews with family members or other people? What was that process?
Yeah, it was it was a very expansive process for me, because I think I started the book prior to my cancer diagnosis, and I actually took a workshop at the Chautauqua Writers Festival. And that was the first place that I felt ready. This was probably 2014, to start thinking about documenting. And so for those first poems, it was really capturing the shadows, the like almost like movie reels that you sort of have about memory as a child. There are certain memories that I think I have really almost made static because I was 7 when we immigrated. And so there's that recognition that probably all the years prior to immigration, all the memories kind of get wrapped up in one thing, in one kind of block. And so I started there. I started with smell and taste, and sort of recollecting just scenes that I think I remember, right, of the beach, of my grandparents' home, of my grandmother's birdcage, because they're very evocative as sort of these private, almost primal memories that I have. And they're really visual. It's interesting. They're not language memories almost at all. They're very visual and sort of embodied, but not linguistic. And so using those as a sort of launching pad, my sisters and I, my parents, we have this kind of strange relationship to our immigration story. We sort of talk about it, but we're also super strangely Chilean, which is to say we don't talk about it a lot. And so I think it's taken all of us into our adulthood to really think back about the stories of Chile and then the stories of immigration. And so in some ways, for me, it was a way to sort of honor that silence, if that makes sense. When in terms of the political situation, again, I've asked my mom things. I've asked, some family members, but Pinochet is still a pretty third rail kind of figure in Chile, and even in private family life. So you kind of know who you're going to talk to and who you're not going to ever talk to about this. And so it works in these very strange and interesting ways. And so I have a poem in The Poison Time There Is Love that talks about kind of like speaking to certain family members and their ideas when I went to visit the Memory Museum, for example, or when I went to Villa Grimaldi. And there was, part of that is fictional, right? What happened, but part of it is sort of a condensation of, people are like, why would you go see that? Why would you go do that when I was there, right? And I find that really interesting, right? That there's still a sense that you don't talk about certain things.
Yeah, I want us to talk about Via Grimaldi in a minute, but I wondered if we could jump over into another poem, and if you'd be willing to read You Have to Leave Me Twice, because for me that is a poem that kind of embodies the complexities of those conversations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Morgan. You have to leave me twice. She said it as if it were a casual thing. Split the ashes, one for the velatorio here, one for the family mausoleum. Be sure the bones are dust enough to fit in a tin can, so they do not give you a hard time at security. This is the great divide, mitad y mitad, ¿entiendes? Me repartes. This is how you bury your dead. There will always be two places. Siempre hay dos. The immigrant always carries twin shadows. Siempre está la sombra. You cannot choose north, south, English, Spanish. You can only split sorrow. No hay medio, ¿entiendes? The body has life, but the dead, they have little weight but sadness. Así es, mijita. Así es. You have to travel to live. You have to travel to die. Me tienes que dejar dos veces. You have to leave me twice. El alma dividida en dos. One soul, two eternities. She stops. Then she asks about the dog.
Wow, thank you. And it seems to me that just captures so much of the doubleness of things that we'll talk about later about language and the immigrant experience, the dual language experience, but also specifically to the stories of your family. And I think that brings us back to Via Grimaldi, because you brought that up before. I was thinking about, how do you engage with writing a violent history that your readers might not know about, especially in this moment, how quickly news cycles go through, and like what you have to expect the reader knows or doesn't know. I wonder if you might even read that poem, tell us a little of the context of the history and about how you went about writing that, knowing that the poem would have to do its work in the world, perhaps, on its own around that subject.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things about writing this book, and I think many of us do this as scholars and as poets, is there is the personal history that you are accessing. But I did a lot of research. I wanted to see these spaces if I could. And so I was really grateful that I was able to do that on my sabbatical, as ironic as it is to be excited or interested in going to see a previous torture site, which is what Villa Grimaldi is. Um, uh, and I did a lot of research. I watched a lot of documentaries. I read several first person accounts of both prisoners who were in concentration or camps right during the regime, where some people were then disappeared. And then I also read a couple of first person accounts of people who were guards in these kind of spaces. And I even delved into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report about what happened post Pinochet after the plebiscite of 1989. How do I think about the specific history? I think I tried in the collection to anchor, so naming, again, I named that poem Villa Grimaldi because it is a specific site. And so I wanted at least to have the opportunity for the reader, if they wanted to go look it up, right? And quickly do a Google search if you know what Villa Grimaldi is. But I also wanted that poem to be very sort of evocative in terms of tone and mood about what isn't at that site. So if you take a tour of Villa Grimaldi, it is a park. It's called like a memorial park. And it's really quite beautiful because one of the things that the Pinochet regime did as they realized they were going to leave or be forced out of power is they tried to erase everything. So these sites of torture were, private homes. They were in the middle of a city. They were sort of expedient, right? And so one of the things in doing the research you realize is, oh my gosh, the whole system was rooted in the ability to forget as soon as it was over. Even the phrase we use, right? The disappeared, right? You can forget like who they are specifically. So I wrote Villa Grimaldi after I visited it and after I read these, and then in the winter I read all these sort of secondary sources and watched documentaries, because it was so striking to me the dissonance between the fact that it was a beautiful day in November when I was there. It was sunny. If you go, you kind of, on the one hand, if you know you're going to Villa Grimaldi, it's because you know you're going to a site that used to be a pretty central site of torture and sort of movement of dissidents. But you also would not know it necessarily, right? And so you take this tour, and everything's replicated. Everything has had to be sort of, except for the swimming pool, everything has had to be remade because they destroyed everything after they left. So it was this very strange experience of seeing the names and the wall of names of the victims that were part of Villa Grimaldi, and yet it's a park, it's a memorial park. And even the tree in the middle of the park is this beautiful tree, and there's a rose garden with placards of the names, and then there's placards and art along the sides of the park of the people who've been disappeared and the political parties who were specifically targeted. But the accounts I read of Villa Grimaldi was it was a private home. The swimming pool was actually used on the weekends by some of the guards, and they brought their families and their children to the swimming pool during the weekends while the people were imprisoned in the same place. It just, so all of this to me just felt like, how do I even capture any of this? And so in the end, I decided to go for something. I chose couplets because couplets, right, are not necessarily, they're the sort of maybe the form of love, which is, I think, an interesting decision I was trying to go for that. And I chose to talk about it in a very kind of descriptive way, what I saw and what I researched. But it was also really not trying to capture the violence. I don't think it's possible, if that makes sense. Should I read it? Probably.
Yes, please.
Yeah?
It's a short poem.
Yeah, it's
Please.
very short. Let's see, page 51. So Villa Grimaldi. tongue red gate, steel mouth opens to speckled cement sidewalk. No blood now. No broken bits of teeth and buttons. A hanging tree in the middle, lotus flower shaped. Sky catcher. Once upon a time, a body rack, heavy sacks swinging, legs, arms, gasps, part of the wood. Beyond the ombu, a rose garden, memory space, thick reds, yellows, names in calligraphy on wooden plates, hundreds, buried with each bush. At the edge of the park, empty, mermaid green tiled swimming pool, brown granite mural, lists of the missing, coarse crabgrass bursting out. Beyond the stone wall, the Andes, snow torches looming.
Thank you. I'm so struck with about what you said is this, the poem is an act against forgetting, right? Whether from those who actually have the memory to the next generations, right? Who have to move into the research. And I'm always also thinking about how it's a portal, right? Of that every reader who goes searching for even to find that title, right? And as steps into that world with you. So thank you for reading that. And it makes me think of this other poem, Memory Spaces, which is a Pachakacha, which, the form created by Terence Hayes. And what's really interesting to me is that it's an ekphrastic poem that's also it's in conversation with the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo, and whose sculptures engage with political persecution and violence. And I'm interested in that of reaching, beyond borders to these intersections of what does it mean to make art in the shadow or legacy, or there's so many different words we could use for that. So could you talk a little bit about what drew you to working with her work, and what was that like to write in response to her sculptures?
Yeah. So I have not seen, because her sculptures in part, some of them are installations in museums, and then some of them are like in streets or in cities, right? So like they're sort of temporary in a way. I took a creative writing workshop, and this was one of the artists in the section on ekphrasis. And I, first of all, love an ekphrasis poem. I actually think one of the most amazing things about the ekphrasis, it is outward reaching. It is trying to think, it is its own thing, but it's also trying to think in conversation, in collaboration. And to me, what is poetry if not collaboration? I mean, we are all kind of, even as our own voice is our own, we are instruments and agents of all the voices, all the poets, the histories that we have sort of absorbed. And I loved thinking about the Pechacucha because I tend to actually be long-winded, which is a sort of way for the Pechacucha to capture that possibility. But and they also are miniature worlds. Like each of the 20 units is its own miniature poem. And I was really trying to think in these very discrete ways about that, which maybe is a way, as I think more about the Pechacucha, that it allows for memory to both be expansive as a form, right? It has the space for these 20 kind of vignettes, but it also allows each particular piece to stand on its own and be one moment of the memory, which I think is sort of how memory is, right? Memory is an expansive feeling. It's sort of pre-cognitive. And then when we name it, when we sort of articulate it, it becomes that moment of naming. I think her work is really beautiful and incredible. And I found myself really drawn to the idea of the beauty that she is inviting. So, for example, the very first one, A Flor de Piel, this is a beautiful sculpture that has kind of this leather sheet that spreads around a museum room, and but it's simultaneously beautiful, and also it's evocative of blood. It's evocative of sort of like something that's just thrown in the corner. and that felt to me very much like how sometimes acts of violence are understood simultaneously, sort of central to something, and then also try, at least in the context of what I've read about Chile and even in my own experience, um, try not to be to sort of make them memorable, to again to not name them. So responding to her work made it possible for me to think about collective memory and collective responses, right? This idea that, yes, Chile is individual and unique in its history, but we can make connections to these other spaces and these other artists. And in my world, I would be really, really close friends with a lot of different artists, and we would just spend all our time writing back and forth and engaging in multimedia art back and forth, because I think it's very I love the idea of disrupting the solo single voice and thinking in a more collective way about poetry.
Well, I'm very much in agreement with that. I love collaboration, but I'm interested too in how you're thinking of this form, because it ties back to your conversations about memory. As how does ekphrasis work as a way of this sort of triangulation to deepen that act of memory? So thank you for that answer. I feel like there's a lot to think about there. It's about cross art collaboration and also thinking about systems of oppression, globally, right? And how artists engaging with that, what happens when they're in conversation. I want to kind of backtrack to this core thread of immigration here and talk about language. Because several of the poems engage with the intersections of Spanish and English, starting chronologically with Immigration Office, Oklahoma City, 1985. So there, the speaker is a child of age 10 or 11 who tries to help a man with his forms. And could you read that just as a jumping off point for us to talk about the role of language as subject in this book as well as practice?
Yeah, I'll just read maybe that section. Immigration Office, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Stowaway, I asked, reading the options on the sweat-stained form he held out, his eyes quiet and begging. You came by water? My father wore his only suit that day, white shirt, knit tie, the smell of dry cleaning still stuck inside a blue pilling wool. Not a man for words or mercy. Caught between anger and disgust, my father stared forward, hands folded tightly over a manila envelope, ignored my attempts, meek and uncertain, to help the man pressing paper in front of me. And yeah, this is sort of rooted in, this is actually, quote, true in the sense that when we were applying for our green card, I went with my father several times to sort of to the documentation office, basically, right? Of here's our paperwork and here's how we belong, and there was a person. Again, this is where am I making this up? I do remember this, right? Like I have this actual visceral memory of sort of sitting in these chairs and this man, right, handing me a piece of paper and asking me to help. Could I help him fill out this form? And I think it sort of links this idea that right, documenting immigrants is a sort of systemic problem that, and so I mean it's not rooted in the contemporary moment, right? We have all these examples across the history of the U.S. and certainly in other nations of sort of the need to prove, which is about writing things down, right? And I really I like this trope of how do you disrupt this idea of making legitimate and still having the opportunity to write something down. How do you disrupt it? Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, what I love about that is, to me, and as you say, that being sort of true or out of active memory, this journey of a speaker who, we're going to travel through you know, there's a difference between the father and the speaker, right?
Yes.
That drive to help and to guide someone through language, which, you know, is this trajectory of your whole path as teacher and as writer. And I find that incredibly moving. And so we have, you know, in the poem Before Intersectionality, there's this moment of talking about Spanish in whispers, you know, what can we choose but silence is sort of not Spanish not being allowed. And then later in My English Decades, writing about just magnificently about the sound and power of English as a dominating force. And there's this line and it says, I am waiting for other cadences, living in a muffled longing. So and that just kept resonating with me, and I wondered if you could talk about your relationship to Spanish language in your writing, not only as subject, where it comes up in many different ways in this book, you know, including a few that I brought up, but as practice and.
Wow. Wow. That's the big question, right? That's like one of my big like primal questions. I think even in my academic work, though you wouldn't know it by the subjects that I study, because my experience with language is I love English. I find my love affair with English one of the most evocative and beautiful sort of relationships I've ever had, which was only possible because I was forced to learn it like very young, and I was very nervous, and I remember having a lot of anxiety when I first learned it because I was 7, so I was just learning to read and write in English, and then you come to a new space and you have to sort of quickly adapt to the new language. Um, so for me, right, I think English in some ways, and I don't know how to say it without sounding sort of silly, but like in some ways, writing in English is because I have a sound pre-English that I think is the musicality maybe of Spanish. I don't know, right? But so that I think my desire to try to be precise with line, to try to think about the music of English in some way has to be, I think, inspired by the fact that my first language was Spanish. When I was a kid, my mother used to read poetry to me in Spanish, and I have those memories. And I also, as a very young child, I think this was probably just educationally kind of practiced when I was growing up in certain, you know, middle class families. I would recite poetry in Spanish. Like that was one of the things that like when people would come over and I was like this kid of 5 or 6 and she's like, oh, Sole, you know, why don't you recite the most recent poem you just memorized? I think they were probably, you know, like younger, like Shel Silverstein-ish, right? For sort of young people in Spanish. So for me, Spanish has always sort of been a private language, a language of sort of whispers. When we were first immigrated, there was at least where, as we understood it, right? You wanted to assimilate. You wanted to lose the accent. You wanted to never be identifiable as a Spanish speaker. And so the product of that is I wanted to then learn English. I mean, I think there's just no way that's how I didn't become an English PhD, right? Like it was just sort of the final ability. So the irony is I'm an English PhD because I'm an immigrant from a Spanish speaking nation. We can do a lot of things with that. And so Spanish still is for me a language that I feel not my full self in, but I know that it's deeply part of what the body remembers, what the tongue remembers, what the brain remembers, right? From those early moments. So for me, trying to capture that feeling is part of what this particular poem is about, but also losing Spanish with the first poem of the collection. Even the sort of poems like the last poem, Rooted, which is, you know, in some ways for my goddaughter. Also thinking about what is lost when you try to assimilate so much in a way. And I think this collection, I'm not done thinking about that, I guess you could say. But I think I think that the journey to document what it means to have Spanish at the center, but not quite be able to remember it, is is part of the project.
Yeah, and certainly by starting with losing Spanish and where you end the book, you sort of forefront that this is an important part of the conversation. But I think the thread I want to follow is I love this idea of this bodily musicality, right? Of your work being shaped even by a language that you were pushed to, whisper or leave behind or put English to the forefront, and this idea that you were memorizing and reciting poems. Can you talk about maybe you don't remember what some of those poems are, but other influences of Spanish language poets and writers who have been an influence either in childhood or up through your writer's life?
Yeah. So I never met my maternal grandfather, but apparently he was a musician, and my mother's family had, they kind of were poets in their everyday life. They made up words, they made up whole sort of languages together as a family. And so my mom growing up would kind of like do this as we were sort of growing up. So that was one side of how sort of language was always not linear, right? Or mono. Um, I think that for me, right, hear um, I hear a line as a sort of sound, if that makes sense. And that sound, I think, right, is a sort of pre-linguistic memory of Spanish. I don't know if that's actually true, right? But this is what I've decided. And again, I attribute this to my very dear friend whom I work with, who's a cognitive psychologist who studies bilingualism, and she talks about the sort of synaptic sort of relationships that the brain makes pre-linguistically to certain sounds. And so I wonder if my desire to be very descriptive and very lush and sort of think about how a line doesn't just look on the page but sounds if you say it out loud. I think that has something to do with the fact that Spanish is my first language, even if it's not the language I live most of my life in. I mean, to be fair, like I'm actually super anxious about reading in Spanish and like talking to anybody professionally in Spanish because you carry this like, oh, my Spanish is not great, um, but I think those echoes. I've become more comfortable with idea of being in Spanglish, which is new, which is not something that I have done before. In fact, even in conversations with my siblings, where we mostly, let's be clear, still speak in English, every now and then, like the Spanish words become part of the song of the conversation. And I think even my most descriptively English speaking Anglo-Saxon sort of words, I still think somehow the way they're put together has something to do with the fact that Spanish was my first language.
Yeah, I feel like this, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is particularly rooted to you being an English professor, right? And I'm thinking about the ways that the sort of divided disciplinarity in academic worlds, like what that means for someone who is, that's teaching and loving English literature, but that is not the sole language. And like, oh no, if you're going to write about Spanish literature, right? Or any literature in Spanish, whether it's or Latinx literature, you have to be over in a different department, and what that means for shaping us. So that kind of brings me to another question that I had. It ties into that as well. Is how has being an English professor? Can you talk about the way that's influenced your work, both the ways it offers permission and influences and also maybe obstacles to turning to creative work? And I feel like that's both about the scholarly creative divide and also these linguistic divides that happen in the active shaping departments.
Yeah, that has been my my 20-year sort of tension, is that in my academic, I guess I'll say this, returning to poetry, because I actually did an undergraduate thesis in poetry, right? And then I went to graduate school and studied literature. So after all the sort of metrics of quote success in the academic realm of tenure, right, I felt permission or allowed myself to sort of return in a way to this thing that was very important for me as in fact a lover of literature, which was poetry. as an undergraduate and crafting and writing poetry. The divide for me has been very artificial, but I think I understand why the divide exists. In my own experience, I think that writing poetry after being an academic has allowed me to understand that research and thinking and sort of mapping things out is very much tied to to how I actually create poetry. I'm not as systematic in poetry as I am in my scholarship, but it has been freeing to be a scholar after I have written this poetry collection. In other words, I have actually found a more, I don't like to use the word authentic, but a more comfortable voice as an academic because of the poetry that I have had the privilege of reading and writing. In other words, I actually think the divide is artificial. Right? It's complete because the people I read when I want to think about poetry as an object of craft are poets. I read poets, right? I read poets and writers. I read collections of writers talking about the line, writers thinking about the sort of form, right? And so to me, those are scholars. Those are scholars writing about craft. In the same way, I spent a lot of time doing actual scholarly research to write this very personal collection. And to me, those projects did not seem disconnected. So finding myself able to write a poem has given me, I wrote this in one of my reviews for tenure full professor. It was actually one of the most liberating things I've had the privilege of doing, is getting to do this collection. And it has given me the freedom to return to hybrid scholarly writing, to be less obsessed with sounding smart or have I read all the things I'm supposed to read in order to say something. And I think that's the freedom that writing poetry has given me as a scholar. And as a poet, being a scholar means that I know how to think about the collective voice, which is to say those that came before me, those that are around me, those for whom I want to be in conversation and collaboration with.
I love that, that the push against the artificial divide is through
Yeah.
practice, right?
Yeah.
How we read, which we all do, right? We read across borders, right? Or, we hopefully people are doing it. We read across whatever those borders and boundaries are, and we make art across them as well. And I think it's important to just keep voicing that for those coming up, to see that they don't have to be beholden, even if one thing will get you tenure in one
Right.
area or not, to not let you stop, what you're creating. That makes me think of communities that we're part of, and that's how we also all move between different kinds of communities. And one of those is you've been a fellow at Canto Mundo, working in a community that specifically fosters Latinx writers. So it's a creative space, but also speaking to a particular identity. How did that experience shape this book and even your larger experience to your work, creative or scholarly, in fact?
I think as I was thinking about this book, and I was a fellow, I think in 2017 was my first time going to Canto Mundo, it made me realize that I had a community that would read this book in a very different way, that would approach questions of identity, questions of duality, or even multilinguality, questions of immigration in ways that didn't need to be code switched in the same way. I mean, all of our experiences are very different, right? But there was a real, I was blown away to be a part of a community where I didn't have to explain all the time what I meant by or what it means to. And also, this is going to sound completely small, but it was so important to me as a writer. Being at Canto Mundo was probably one of the first times for a 3-day period where I heard my actual name pronounced correctly, and talking about naming, talking about what it means to name something as an act of liberation. To be called Soledad right? And like to hear it that way for the first time in a group that was more sort of like a writing community or more academic, or not even academic, but just sort of about writing, as opposed to just in the privacy of family, was huge for me. And so it opened me up to practices of song, practices of sort of writing that I still think about. There were several poets at Canto Mundo who sang their poems, like actually sang their poems. And I just thought, I am enamored of this moment, right? Because of course the poem is in fact comes from the lyric, it comes from song, from the balladeer, and that meant it was embodied in a very different way. And I tried to think about that also, even as I was putting the final touches to the collection.
Powerful, that return to the power of naming, literally,
Yeah.
walking into a room and being heard and named, and how valuable that is. There's a lot I think we can talk about there, but I'm seeing that we're probably don't have quite a lot of time left. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is the thread of poems that engage with your cancer diagnosis, and that is, particular personal journey that really impacted this book and the direction that it went. I wondered if you might read the order of things and then
Sure.
talk to us a little bit about how this comes into the book.
Yeah, thanks. The order of things. As with all things now, I want order. I want to take the strings of chaos, the lonely stamp, the leftover paper, the bruised, too ripe peach, the thick flyaway gray hairs, and stack them. Stack them in a row, put them in a box, label each part, taking time to make sure I note the skin of the peach, the wire tangle of the hair, the missing colors of the faded stamp. I want to make them whole again, full and not dead or dying. Order is a place of rest and stopping. Long ago I said I wanted to be light, the way silk feels light against the heat of the sun. I imagined floating in this world, always sure of how beautiful the mess would be. But I have learned cells can grow to wild proportions along the inside pulsing parts of the body, carving their path with serrated blades along muscle tissue, the pink inside of the breast, under the arm reaching for the small jellyfish glands. This was more than a mess. Those cells, an aching mouth of angst and blood, urgent for the rest of it, the rest of me, and I alone in this jungle of living, a stumbling wanderer. This is not the story I wanted. Yeah, so what I was very sure about is that I didn't want this to be a cancer book, right? And in fact, the trajectory of my life did not kind of make that possible. But as I was in the middle of writing this book, I had this diagnosis. And I think naming the institutions that name cancer became really important for me. Diagnoses are brutal, and the structures that allow for the healing and for kind of medicine to sort of make your body cured or whole again are actually very violent. And that to me felt actually really connected to the project, prior, about kind of political memory and sort of autobiographical immigration memory. And then I also tried very hard to think about cancer as just a thing. And I thought, I read as a consummate academic, I read a lot about cancer. I spent a lot of time in my own charts of diagnoses, and even sort of the language that is used is so, what do I want to say, bureaucratic, sort of alienating. And so in the titular poem, I was a bell, right? I was really thinking about like my body and my moments are kind of having this real pain, this real moment of, and this loss, right? A diagnosis of this kind is going to, for me, was about loss. And yet the language is never about loss. It's just about naming. It's an alternative weird project of naming, but it's naming to sort of just kind of pinpoint for treatment, not a naming as a moment of liberation, right? So for me, I started thinking about my own cells. Like everyone's cancer is their own, it's unique. Your own body makes it, right? It's oncotype as well. So I spent many, many sort of weeks and months sort of thinking about that. And so I wanted cancer to be part of the story because the way that also for me was very evocative is in Chile, people talked about dissidence as a cancer on society, right? And so this idea of something growing that is alien, except for cancer isn't alien. Cancer is yours. It's very much unique to you. And I thought that was really like how memory is. In some ways, cancer is like a memory of my body. My body made it out of its memories. And then it decided to grow and do this other stuff. But what cancer is life. Cancer cells want to live. That's their project. They're not good or bad. They're just you. And I have friends who were like, this is a very bizarre way to think about cancer because, you know, the metaphors of cancer are about war, fighting, winning, struggling, right? She lost her battle with, or she won her battle with. And I was I really just wanted it to be, well, my body has this memory of cancer now. What's that going to mean for the body?
I think it's so powerful. We think of this book as a model of, you know, we're writing a book, we think it's about one thing, and then
Yes.
life happens, right, to
Yes.
disrupt that. And I think one of the ways you've so beautifully integrated these threads is that you've articulated this connection of the role of memory and embodiment of, you know, circling back to that question of documentation. I thought of that moment of, you know, the child self helping the man in the office, and then the adult self needs the help
Yeah.
navigating, you know, medical language as another one. And also this act of you know, the kinds of things that fully disrupt a life and threaten a life. And I think it's just incredible the way that you've brought those together in the shaping of the book. To 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 kind of get to one other sort of symbol that comes through the book is there's this idea of flight, right?
Yeah.
And where does that tie into those threads? And birds with this beautiful, you know,
Yeah.
cover, and but also planes, right? This what is there anything that you want to say about that
Yeah.
motif in the collection?
So, I mean, flight is sort of like a primal, I think, right? Movement, but flight for some of us, for me, is a primal symbol of migration, right? Of immigration, right? Like my first plane ride that I ever remember, which I write about in Flight Plan, is flying. Which I hate to do. I hate moving, right? It's ironic. I'm a scholar of travel narratives and I wrote a whole book about being an immigrant, and yet I actually loathe movement of my own body. So for me, it was very evocative because this idea of movement, and it's sort of movement through language, movement through the space in the collection, right? So we start in the kind of panhandle of Oklahoma, but then it kind of moves through memory, moves through a different geography, right? And I think that flight can be, right, on the one hand, it can be a metaphor of movement. And some of us think of it as a metaphor of liberation. But actually, again, I'm a terrible birder, right? I would never be an ornithologist of any real kind, which I talk about in Someday I Will Visit Hawk Mountain. But birds are actually incredibly not free, ironically, right? They are bound by the biology of their migration patterns. They're bound by their sort of own impulses to move, almost disruptively, almost sometimes destructively. And I liked that impulse to think about sort of, again, complicating a dichotomy of any kind between movement and stasis, between Spanish and English, between North and South. Um, so I and I think birds for me, I also was really, despite everything I just said about birds not being free, I actually love birds, and I think they're one of the few things in nature, because I'm not a huge nature person actually. They're one of the few things in nature that actually make me sort of gasp when I see birds in flight, specifically birds of prey. And again, I love birds of prey. They eat things. They're not just this like cute songbird. And I think that's a lot of what this book is about, is there's beauty in moments that might not originally feel beautiful.
Wow, these answers are such a reflection of just the deep thoughtfulness in these poems that make them so textured and complex. Maybe would you be willing to read Bird Girl?
Yeah,
Uh,
sure. Okay, this will be the um, bird girl. Half her life she has been gone in silence, in the darkness. Who took her? Who disappeared? This girl, willowy and sweet. A black bird of a girl with dark, liquid eyes, smoke mouth, a smile like a song, a secret, a smile like light through the leaves of a tree. This girl, bird girl, laughing girl, with no freckles, no moles, just a scar, the scar on her nose, a sliver of a scar. This girl with eyes like rain, silver eyes, silver scar. This bird of a girl with morning ahead of her that day, and work and coffee and cream and sugar and coffee, the sun warm on her skin. This bright bird of a girl leaving home for work, for school, for life. This bird of a girl who walked from the mall to the beach to the sunset to the rocks after school, after work, after home, she walked and left no prints, no scratches, no blood, no books, no pictures, no phone, just a shadow of herself. Bird girl, who took you, bird girl, who made you so small we could not find you with any words or guns or people or stories or secrets or love, who made you so small.
Beautiful. Thank you for
Thanks,
reading that
Morgan.
one. I think, as we come toward our ending, maybe the last question I want to ask is that we can even just start to talk about the ending of the book. And the book begins with she speaks a gringo Spanish, right? And ends with the niece who is the line, the first to be grown from here.
Yeah.
And I wonder, as you sort of moved into that next generation, talking about ending there and also what that portends for what comes next for you in terms of what you're thinking and writing about.
Yeah, so I didn't realize it until the book was almost out in the world, but I actually think this collection, if I was thinking of a specific audience, it was for my sister's children, right? The sort of folk, the sort of kids who were born here, right? Not the 1.5 like my sisters and me. Um, so I liked this idea of sort of opening the book at the end to the future, right? Which is what I hope the sort of ending of that of this collection does. And I have a draft of a second collection, and in that there's still some of these themes, but I think I'm actually, to get to your previous question about being an academic, I'm actually kind of exploring my journey as an academic in that collection more. I'm I don't know, could you qualify it as like a middle-aged kind of lady, kind of woman, sort of, I'm almost 50. I'm not, right? Let's just be clear. But I am 48, and I'm thinking of like, what does it mean to be in this body um, out of my 5-year cancer diagnosis as a middle-aged kind of like thinker and writer. And so that for me, that was sort of leaving the poem rooted there allowed me the possibility of returning to some of these questions, but also exploring other avenues of my identity. Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to see a sneak peek of that manuscript, and I'm very excited about where you're headed. But of course, today we're here to celebrate this gorgeous debut collection, I Was a Belle. It's each time I've read this many times in process and now in print, and I'm just struck by its richness and power, and I'm just so grateful to have had this conversation and get to learn more pieces from behind the book and beyond the book, and help readers have this gateway into the collection as well. And so thank you, Soledad and Francisco and Zach. It's so wonderful of you to have us here for this conversation and to be part of this series for this collection.
Yes, I thank you, Morgan. I want to thank Morgan. She really has been. Francisco called her a citizen poet, and really her generosity and her sort of breadth and her sort of passion and her creativity as a poet have been an inspiration to me for the last 20 years. And I want to again thank Francisco and the Writers Center, the Duende District Books, Poet Lore, and Letras Latinas, along with the Poetry Foundation, for putting this together. And thank you to everyone who will, I hope, benefit from this beautiful project that Francisco has put together.